Welcome to this month's episode of RTO Insights, brought to you by APRO, the National Trade Association for the Rent-to-Own Industry, and sponsored by Rent Direct, a division of Nationwide, the country's largest retail buying group. In this episode, I'd like to talk a little bit about disclosure in rental agreements. There are other disclosure issues in advertising and price tags. We'll take those up in another episode. The foundation of consumer protection law everywhere in this country is that merchants should be disclosing everything that's important to a transaction for consumers, and then the consumers can evaluate that information and decide whether they want to do the deal or not. That's obviously not enough for some consumer advocates. Some of those people want to tell other people how to spend their money. It's not so much unlike telling school children what they can eat for lunch, or most recently, social justice warriors want to tell people where they should be living. The country really hasn't gone that far yet in the consumer protection world, and for the moment, disclosure is the rule. The standard for disclosing is not the general standard in the legal world, which is what would a reasonable person want to know about a transaction. Rather, in the consumer protection world, it's what would a credulous and unsophisticated consumer need to know about a transaction. That's a very low bar, a much lower bar than the reasonable person standard that operates in most other areas of the law. And there was a debate about whether or not the rental industry could afford to disclose the total cost of the transaction. Some dealers thought, oh my, if we ever disclose the total cost, nobody will ever rent a TV from us. Those guys lost the debate. The trade association and enlightened rental dealers very early on were voluntarily disclosing the total cost of the transaction and doing it at the top of the agreement so everybody knew in advance what it was going to cost if a customer wanted to rent long enough to own. Rental dealers were also voluntarily disclosing the rental rate, the rental term, a description of the property, the risk of loss, cash price. As state laws began to be enacted regulating RTO transactions, those became the required disclosures in RTO transactions. Other disclosures that those statutes require are description and amount of all other charges that might exist between the customer and the dealer, how much is the initial payment, what's the early purchase option formula, who has the maintenance responsibility, what sort of warranty coverage, if any, is there, will you transfer the manufacturer's warranty if the customer gets ownership, customer's reinstatement rights, do you offer liability damage waiver, do you require insurance? Those are the main kinds of disclosures that are required under the state RTO statutes. A few states go on to require the disclosure of the cost of lease services, which is the difference between the total cost and the cash price, and is akin to disclosing a finance charge in a retail installment sales contract, which is the difference between that total cost and the cash price. One state, New Hampshire, has a curious disclosure. It reads like this: if you want to buy the property now, you should consider cash or credit terms that might be available to you. That's sort of a cheap shot against the RTO transaction that made its way into law in that state. Consumer advocates over the years have lobbied for an interest rate disclosure in RTO transactions. They have not been successful anywhere really in requiring that in getting that disclosure required by state law. The only way that they can have that disclosure made is to pretend or assume that the customer is going to make all the payments required for ownership, not exercise an early purchase option, not return the merchandise, not exercise reinstatement rights, not return the property and swap it for something else. And so it's really sort of a false assumption, but it's the only way you could get to an interest rate disclosure in an RTO transaction. A few years ago, when the Consumer Leasing Act was being amended, some consumer advocates wanted an APR disclosure in consumer leases. The Federal Reserve Board took a look at the issue, took testimony from both sides of the question, and ultimately determined that an APR disclosure in a consumer lease was inappropriate. It was too subject to manipulation by lessors and would mislead consumers. Years ago, the Vermont Attorney General, in a rule for RTO transactions in that state, required the disclosure of an EAPR, an effective annual percentage rate, once again requiring the assumption that a customer would make all the payments necessary for ownership and acquire ownership of the property after 18, 24 months. Just this spring, the Vermont legislature finally realized the error of its ways and did away with that requirement in Vermont. Disclosing all of the pertinent aspects of the transaction and putting those disclosures in plain English and in big print just makes good sense in the RTO industry. You do have some unsophisticated and credulous consumers. You do not want them to be confused. Confused customers down the line can be dangerous. So I would encourage all of you to review your state laws, make sure you are making all of the appropriate disclosures, and remember, treat your customers like royalty. They deserve it.